Okay, I think we can start. Good afternoon and good morning to those connecting from the US, and a warm welcome to this webinar, which I have the pleasure to host from Brussels, from the European Parliament. This morning or this afternoon, we have a stellar panel of speakers joining us today to discuss the shifts occurring in the Middle East as we speak. On the one hand, as everybody knows, we are keeping a close eye on the intense negotiations taking place in Vienna under the auspices of the European Union to make a return to the nuclear deal with Iran. And on the other hand, the more secretive but also known talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran, facilitated by the Iraqis in an attempt to move away from the confrontational relationship that has characterized relations between Riyadh and Tehran for decades. The two talks reinforce each other and should be seen as an opportunity, as we speak, to build a new regional diplomacy architecture that shifts the Middle East towards de-escalation. While hopes are high, caution still needs to be maintained, and I'm sure that we will have the chance to analyze that with our speakers today. We have experts from the region, and we will discuss the dynamics and the prospects of this emerging detente, and the role that the external actors like the EU, but also the US and others can play. And to moderate this panel, it is really a pleasure to have with us Bobby Ghosh, who is a Bloomberg columnist and member of the editorial board and an expert of the region himself. Thank you, all of you. Thank you for having accepted the invitation. I'm sure Bobby will introduce us, our speakers, and I'm looking forward very much for this fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Bobby. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ernest, and thank you to the audience. Thank you for joining us today on a topic that is both evergreen but also very urgent right now and of particular significance at this particular time. If you've been following the news from the Middle East for the past month, it might seem that some things don't change. Israel and Hamas go to war, and ordinary people, Muslim Palestinians, get caught in the crossfire, and there is tragedy and trauma on the ground in Gaza and in parts of Israel. But there are important things that are happening, some of it behind the scenes, that point to, hopefully, dare we say, a more optimistic direction. As Ernest mentioned there are talks going on, or have been talks going on, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Historically, rival powers with very little love lost between them. But with Iraqi mediation, there have recently been talks against the backdrop of that, which is, of course, the negotiations that are taking place in Vienna. We're up to round 5 or round 6, depending on how you count, where Iran and the world powers, and particularly one world power, the United States, trying to figure out whether they can rescue and resuscitate the Jcpoa, the Iran nuclear deal. So we have an interesting backdrop, an interesting time to have this conversation, and I'm delighted to say that we have a panel that is both stellar and particularly who bring particular expertise to these topics at these very times. I'm joined by Fatma Al-Arimi, who's co-founder and managing director of the Media Center. Emel Shalin, who's a research fellow for the Middle East at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington. Adnan Tabatabai, who's a co-founder and CEO for the Center for Applied Research in partnership with the Orient in Bonn, and especially worth noticing that he is joining us from the front seat of his car. And he will explain in a moment why that is so. And finally, Nicola Pede, who's director for the Institute of Global Studies in sunny Rome. And the format will be as follows. I will invite each of our speakers to clear their throats with a little 7-minute overview of how they view the developments from their particular vantage positions. Then there'll be a little bit of Q&A, which I will moderate. And then we will leave the last half hour of this discussion for questions from the audience. And don't wait that long to ask your questions. Ask away as soon as you feel a question coming up. And if time allows, I will also introduce a little twist to format in asking each of the panelists to challenge one or all of the other panelists with a question of their own. All of this is designed to make my job as easy as possible and my limited contributions as limited as possible. I hope and I know that we will have an absorbing and engrossing conversation. And I will start by asking Anel to get us off the ground with 7 minutes on your view from Washington.
Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. So yes, I'm here in Washington, D.C., and today is Memorial Day here in the U.S., when I hope that American policymakers will remember that many of the American service members who have died recently were fighting wars abroad that were not, in fact, necessary for American security. So when thinking about Iran and a possible return to the Jcpoa, I will frame my remarks with this as a core interest for the US, avoiding yet another war in the Middle East. War with Iran would be significantly more costly than any of our other ill-advised wars in the region. So to understand the US perspective, we should look at where the US government is prioritizing spending. Obviously, given COVID, its economic effects, and the Democrats' desire to maintain their slim majority in Congress, domestic spending is taking priority, but defense spending will also remain high. A few days ago, the Biden administration released its full budget proposal for 2022, which included $715 billion for the Pentagon, which maintains Trump's already high military budget. Although the president's budget is non-binding and Congress will craft their own, the president's budget conveys his administration's preferences. Similarly, the new US Interim National Security Strategic Guidance prioritizes countering China and modernizing nuclear facilities, with only one paragraph on the Middle East. That paragraph opens with a statement on maintaining support for Israel and asserts the need to, quote, work with our regional partners to deter Iranian aggression, end quote. However, it also states the following: but we do not believe that military force is the answer to the region's challenges, and we will not give our partners in the Middle East a blank check to pursue policies at odds with American interests and values. In this, the Biden administration reinforces the perception felt by many in the region that the Middle East is no longer the priority it once was. This perception is widespread despite the fact that the US continues to maintain a significant troop presence in the Middle East, something close to 60,000 soldiers. So although Biden is withdrawing US forces from Afghanistan, he has not announced a significant reduction of the US's forward deployed presence in the broader region. And yet America's security partners, especially in the Persian Gulf, feel that the US can no longer be counted on to guarantee their security. This is based partly on the absence of a response from the Trump administration regarding the attacks on Aramco's Abqaiq oil facility in September 2019, and arguably goes back to the lack of a response from the Obama administration when Bashar al-Assad crossed a, quote, red line in Syria by using chemical weapons against his population in 2013. The Saudis, Emiratis, and other US partners have begun to act as if the US has already pulled out or will do so soon, as evidenced by recent talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran in Baghdad to discuss regional concerns such as Yemen and generally refuse tensions. Yet for years, many argued that without the US in the region, the Middle East would devolve into chaos. They maintain this argument despite the mounting evidence that the massive US military presence was not in fact preventing violence and instead sometimes initiated wars. And so instead, we observe that a perception of reduced US commitment has prompted Gulf leaders to pursue diplomacy, as none of them are interested in taking on the costs of war, especially without significant support from the US. The US does want to get out of the Middle East. Obama recognized that the best way to do that would be to reduce tensions with Iran. There is widespread rejection of Trump's maximum pressure as a failed strategy, as well as general rejection of regime change as a strategy. Meanwhile, China is trying to secure access to Persian Gulf oil, on which the US no longer is as dependent as it once was. As a result of increased partnership with China, Iran now has alternatives, such that even if the US decided to maintain sanctions, Iran can continue to export fuel to China. And in general, the US needs to understand that imposing economic sanctions as a means of trying to coerce adversaries is in fact counterproductive. As a policy, it almost achieves the desired change in behavior. See 60 years of ineffective sanctions against Cuba. And by over-reliance on sanctions, the US speeds the process by which these countries seek alternatives to the dollar, thereby hastening the moment when the dollar will no longer serve as the world's reserve currency. Yet US policymakers know that Americans are sick of fighting wars abroad, especially in the Middle East, so sanctions are seen as a low-cost means of taking some kind of action short of deploying troops. And yet troops do remain engaged in hostile military actions in anywhere from 7 to 14 countries abroad. The number is unknown because some of these missions are clandestine, such as we observed in 2018 when 4 American soldiers were killed in Niger, a country where most Americans were not aware that the US was involved in any kind of active conflict. So again, rejoining the JCPOA offers the surest means of avoiding war with Iran. Opposition to rejoining comes primarily from Republicans. This is based on antipathy towards Iran, much of which goes back to 1979, and is sometimes driven by an apparent preference for Israel's interests over those of the US. Republicans have led congressional efforts to try to persuade Biden not to return to the JCPOA, or to only do so if the deal includes additional areas of concern, such as Iranian missiles and support for militant groups elsewhere in the region. Similar concerns that the deal did not go far enough were made by Israeli and Arab security in 2015. Yet at the time that the JCPOA was being negotiated among the permanent members of the UN Security Council, the P5 plus 1, Germany, as well as the EU, Saudi Arabia and the UAE did not want the deal to go into regional questions because they were not at the table. Israel also did not want the deal to extend beyond the nuclear issue for fear that in order to achieve concessions, regional concern, the P5 plus 1 compromise on aspects of Iran's nuclear program. So that the deal is too limited or disingenuous based on their earlier demands. Likewise,
and now you have 1 minute.
Thank you. Likewise, Iran hawks in Congress are unlikely to agree to any deal with Iran, no matter its scope. If the Biden administration manages to return to the JCPOA, they're probably not going to expand it. From his perspective, it's not worth it. He's just going to try to re-enter the deal and then let regional actors work with Iran on their own concerns. This is more appropriate given the urgency of preventing the possibility of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, as well as the fact that these regional powers need to get better at hashing out solutions to regional issues on their own. Biden has said he wishes to revitalize American diplomacy, which atrophied under Trump, but also suffered from years of inadequate funding. As the world moves from a unipolar to a multipolar balance of power, the US must become more adept at negotiating desired outcomes rather than wasting resources on unnecessary wars. And yet negotiation requires compromise, which is an area where the US is out of practice. So perhaps we could learn from our friends in Europe about how to negotiate and achieve compromise rather than habitually resorting to coercion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anel, for that view from Washington. Fatma, why don't you take it next?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I know that I'm expected to speak on behalf of the GCC as one voice, but the problem is the GCC does not have one voice on the matter when it comes to Iran, not even on normalizing relation with Israel. So, but I will take it from what is seen, what is heard, and what's felt. Mainly, there are two louder opinions when it comes to the GCC. One believe that we should engage with Iran to achieve peace. Others believe that after we achieve peace, only then we can engage Iran in any sort of dealings. That's why some of them see a priority on the deal with the US, the nuclear deal, or rejoining the nuclear deal. The other party sees we can pave the way by other smaller steps that at least makes Iran feel it's more welcomed to play with the international league. Then they can actually stop posing a threat, if I might say, to others. And we have different actors to support these two voices. We have, and also some changes. We have the Saudi stand, which the change itself in the Saudi stand towards Iran is a big change. It's not only about the talks that's happening via Iraqis, but also the statements that we receive from MBS regarding dealing with Iran, which is again one of the good steps that tells the region that we, as a major player in the region, as Saudi Arabia, are willing to engage with Iran and normalize relation with Iran. So it is sort of an invitation to others to also join the club. But one of the main challenges is going to be, what about the concerns? Because one of the texts on the 2015 deal, especially from Saudi and the UAE, is that their concerns were not addressed. They do not necessarily want to be there on the negotiation table, but they want their voices to be heard via a mediator, or to be sitting on the next room, listening to what is being said, and also expressing their concerns. Now, these concerns, of course, will vary from whether it's Saudi Arabia and the UAE, or other countries like Oman that does not see Iran as a threat, but as a friendly neighbor that we can deal with, or we can even do business with, or Qatar also that in some occasions deal with. Kuwait was under pressure for some time to have limited relation with Iran, especially in 2017. At the same time with the Gulf crisis with Qatar. So these different voices made it very difficult to know who wants what from the Iran deal. And is Iran actually willing to address all these concerns, or is it better for Iran to also to be part of the region first, then they can tune down their so-called interventions or their impact or influence in other countries in the region. So this is the overall scene from the GCC, how they see it. Now, with the talks happening right now on what's going to happen, will the deal go on? There are ups and downs, and yes, we see that in Yemen things are a bit calmer now, but it's not 100% what they're looking for. Houthis sometimes they are willing to talk with the representative, the UN and the US envoy that come to Oman occasionally, but on the other occasion they refuse to, and that's what happened on the last few months. Once they met the second time, they said no, we are not willing to meet, and we reject any plan to stop our attacks. But then they went back to the negotiation table and they were willing to talk. So this fluctuation in the stand by the Houthis and is also impacting what is the role of Iran. Is Iran really controlling Houthis and their actions or not? Because this is also has to be there on the table. It is more felt from the GCC country that Iran wants to be part of the region. Iran wants to do business. They want to be able to trade, to get their money back into the country, the frozen assets. They would like to attract investments, but they cannot do that. That's why they are finding other ways. Like Anil was saying, that they had a deal, started dealing with China when it comes to oil. They're doing the same thing with Venezuela. And just yesterday, Reuters report on even the US getting a shipment from Iran, despite the sanctions in March, a cargo of almost 1 million barrel, which shows Iran's ability to maneuver around these sanctions. So they are not that much effective. The only way for Iran to play by the rules is to be joining the club. Now, the main concerns from some GCC countries is about the missiles and the nuclear program of Iran. And here comes the question from other GCC countries to come this idea. If you are concerned about the missiles that might be launched from Iran, what about other close countries as well that you have normalized relation with, like Israel that has nuclear power? Don't you have a concern about them as well? But why are you willing to have relations with Israel, but not with Iran, despite Iran's repeated commitment that they are not after nuclear weapons, but for energy uses or peaceful uses in general? one of the things that the GCC is trying to push for is to enable Iran to understand that this is a very good chance for them with the U.S. administration, with the current administration, because the Democrats have the three main branches. They have the White House and both of the chambers as well. So if Iran is able to reach any sort of agreement, it can be passed as a law. And this will give it a certain security, despite what might happen in the next presidential election, if even Trump is going to be back in the office or any one of the Republicans. So that will help protect this deal at least from the future changes. But at the same time, I hear a lot of the GCC delegates are talking to the European counterparts, because even when the 2015 deal fell apart, the Europeans did not honor the word as well. They did not stick to the deal.
Fatma, you have 1 minute. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Okay. No worries. So when Trump withdrew from the deal, the European countries, they did not try to, they did not take any actions to actually keep the relations normal with Iran, or to at least work on the deal. They just left it to Trump, and they followed the footsteps. So this is one of the concerns as well. Why should the Iranians also trust the Europeans again if this scenario might be repeated in the future? And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Fatma. Adnan, from the front seat of your car, give us a perspective from your windscreen.
I certainly will, dear Bobby. Thank you, and thanks to Ernest and his wonderful team for setting up today's event with great colleagues. I actually really want to start with a rather positive or rather optimist view in the near future, and that can start with looking into the past 2 years, which for several reasons have really been devastating for the Persian Gulf region. The year 2019 brought a level of escalation in that body of water in the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf that was quite unprecedented in its frequency and in the nature of some of the incidents and attacks that happened on tankers, on oil facilities, etc. And that year was followed by the devastating effects of the pandemic of COVID-19, and with that coinciding a shift in the energy market, which has forced countries of that region to rethink a lot of things, not only how they relate to countries of their neighborhood, but also how they basically run the economies of their country. And to some extent, they also really have to think about some sorts of social contracts that exist in every single of these countries, and how to keep a population satisfied that has growing demands, is getting younger, etc., etc. So what we're seeing in the first half of 2021 are may in fact be consequences of some people coming to their senses, and this is getting materialized in two capitals. So I very much like the title of your event, From Vienna to Baghdad, because we are in fact seeing talks going on which are by design and on paper kept separate, because interlocutors and stakeholders involved in that insist on these two being kept separate. But the substance of it really has an impact on the respective other talks that are going on. So let's start with the talks in Vienna. And we have seen lots of ups and downs. Fatma has already alluded to that from the very beginning of the, after the inauguration of the Biden team. So we felt that with Biden in office, with the foreign policy team in Washington that has in large parts been working jointly, or has been working with Barack Obama to seal the deal, the Jcpoa, this team is now back, and everyone felt that now things should be really going easily and fast. And I won't do a recap of all the things that went up and down, but we were really close to a scenario in which things would really fall apart, I would say up until mid-March, but things are looking more positive now. And I think the key for that is that both in DC and in Tehran, the political will to make this happen is really strong enough and has been able to withstand events like Israel's cyber attack on the nuclear facilities of Natanz, attacks on Israeli tankers in the Red Sea, if I'm not mistaken, attacks on Iranian tankers, different sorts of political messaging that has been highly escalatory. But the talks in Vienna have, regardless of these events, been going on. And I think that really shows that all sides really want this to materialize. And obviously the EU E3 +2 plus the US, we have to say, are all involved in this, but it goes without saying that DC and Tehran are the most important ones here. And in both sides, both in Washington and in Tehran, the domestic scene is not for this deal to be easily reinstated. There is no real popularity about the JCPOA in DC. That's at least what some people have been saying, writing, etc. So it's not an easy sell for the Biden administration to simply go back. There needs to be some additional assurances and some more concessions from Tehran and Iran as well. You should hear what the messaging that happens both in the media, but also in parliament and elsewhere, about how the sitting government has sold out Iran, etc. These kinds of allegations have been happening. So selling at home that a return to the JCPOA is a good thing is not an easy task. And I'm mentioning all of this to really say that in spite of all these domestic pressures, officials from either side coming out and giving some sort of a promising signal that things are going ahead in spite of them being difficult, is really reassuring that there must really be some progress, because unless there is some progress made, they wouldn't really be daring to say something like that in public. And that may particularly hold true for the Iranian side that I know most about, so that when we have the lead negotiator, Abbas Araghchi, giving interviews and saying positive things about the talks, slightly different than having President Hassan Rouhani saying this, who is trying to bring his two-term presidency to a positive end. And I therefore believe that they are making some significant progress in Vienna. The point where they are stuck, and that's no surprise, is that in these 4 years of let me call it this way, Trump's assault on diplomacy and the nuclear deal as an accomplishment of that. So in these 4 years, the US has reached a much more sophisticated level of sanctioning the hell out of Iran. And at the same time, Iran has developed its research and development of the nuclear agreement further. Both sides have produced knowledge on these two fronts that cannot be forgotten. And that makes it a bit difficult to simply walk back to the nuclear agreement as it was sealed in 2015. I feel that these are the discussions of the final, let's say, few kilometers that are left to really champion the return to the JCPOA. There are some details that we may be able to speak about during the Q&A, but the most significant thing in my view really is what have both sides accomplished in these 4 years or achieved that cannot be reversible, and that's the most difficult part, I guess. And with regards to Iran's domestic scene, the fact that Javad Zarif, the foreign minister, is now not a presidential candidate may make it easier for the nuclear negotiating team of Iran to bring this deal to a positive end, because otherwise opponents at home would say this is just an election move by the sitting government and its foreign minister, and would be pushing back more strongly against it. The Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei has also made clear that the decisions about the JCPOA or any other grand decision on foreign policy is designed in the Supreme National Security Council, and the Foreign Ministry is basically just implementing it. So this is also important for us to bear in mind with regards to the upcoming presidential elections, that continuity on that front can be expected. What may differ in dependence to or in relation to or depending on who will become president, the messaging will be different. It will be probably not as easy and accessible to find Iranian negotiators who speak English properly enough so that negotiations can be in English. You need interpretation, etc. These things might be more difficult in the future. Bobby, give me a hint of how many more minutes.
You've got a minute. You've got a minute.
1 minute?
Yeah.
Okay. So then let me briefly then just speak about the talks in Baghdad. And I think it's an extremely important thing happening. The first thing is that these talks are happening between security officials of both sides. And you could basically say those guys are the ones who should also start sitting down and talking together. So military and security officials on both sides have met 2 or 3 times. There are different reports about that in Baghdad to discuss in very focused manner Yemen as a context. And that is an important start. And I really believe that while this has nothing to do with the talks in Vienna, it can help to raise a point that Fatma also raised, that there are talks between some GCC stakeholders and Iran happening right now that can in fact alleviate some of their concerns, so that if the JCPOA is really finalized, and I would say it's going to be finalized, then there are less GCC concerns and there might be more regional buy-in, while Iran and Saudi Arabia may hopefully then elevate these talks between security officials at some point to the level of diplomacy. I will allow myself to share a link with you in this chat here on a brief commentary that I have co-authored with colleagues from the Stimson Center Europe, Kawa Hassan and Desiree Custers, on the talks in Vienna, in Baghdad, sorry, so that there are also some more details on this. With that, back to you, dear Bobby.
Thank you very much, Adnan. Nicola, thank you very much for waiting patiently. And it's your turn, 7 minutes, on how the view from the European perspective.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to this interesting meeting. Well, let me add that I share Adnan's optimism, and that's why you will hear some criticism on Europe in my speech. It's not a critique per se, but more a stimulus not to lose opportunities. Well, my personal feeling is that Europe has been progressively marginalized on most of these important dossiers for several reasons. First, and probably the most important, is, as usual, deriving from the traditional difficulty in defining a common line of conduct, with the result more and more often of an asynchrony between the position of the European Union and the single member states. The agendas of the countries of the so-called EU3 in particular are the expression of very different positions and often divergent from the position of the European Union itself, and completely alien to any form of interaction with the other member countries. The second reason for the European weakness is to be found, in my opinion, in the complex management of the JCPOA during the 4 years of the Trump administration. Despite statements of principle and the adoption of weak instruments for the financial management of the agreement, such as what was for example, the INSTEX, the European Union has been characterized by very little assertiveness toward the United States. Without great incentives to offer Iran, the European has literally let itself be overwhelmed by the US action, assuming an increasingly marginal profile in the management of the multinational dialogue. Last but not least, an element of fragility for the European Union has been the management of individual bilateral relations with the main member countries of the EU with the monarchies of the Persian Gulf. And from Iran to Libya, through Yemen, Syria, the Horn of Africa, all of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia has represented an element of fundamental importance in the construction of the individual interest of many European countries, with consequences which, in my opinion, have produced disastrous results throughout the region. On the dualism between the Gulf monarchies and Iran, and on the mutual perception of the counterpart as an existential threat, a large part of the European defense industry has been able to count on armed orders of a unique magnitude in history, probably higher in volume and amount than those which characterize the 8 years of war between Iran and Iraq. And the European Union thus lacked in the capacity of favoring the necessary process of regional dialogue. On the one hand, accepting the legitimate concern of the Gulf monarchies toward the perception of Iran as an expansive and hegemonic actor, but on the other side also to guarantee Iran the equally legitimate space for economic and potential growth, penalized by 40 years of isolation and marginalization. So this is where, in my opinion, we have failed more than ever in this process. The combination of these factors has led us, as a European Union, to strongly weaken our role, our capacity, and our credibility. The current positive evaluation of the dynamics of regional and international dialogue is the product, in my opinion, of an evolution where the role of the European Union has been marginal, to be generous. The dialogue on the Jcpoa has resumed by the initiative of the United States, and thanks to the contextual Iranian interest in the definition of a solution. The European Union has been very little active in this resumption, and probably the EU 3 countries has represented and continue to represent more an obstacle rather than a solution to the negotiation. The situation is, in my opinion, very well understood by the Iranians, which has in fact urged the European countries with which it has built an excellent bilateral relationship, such as Italy or Spain, to take an independent initiative with respect to the EU3. And Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif's recent trip to Madrid and Rome, which was also supposed to include Vienna, but which was cancelled because of the issue of the flag, was aimed exactly in this direction. The dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran at the same time has been favored, in my opinion, by a series of dynamics that include a partial change in the internal political balance of the Saudi crown, the role of MBS in particular, Riyadh's fear of a radical revision of the US regional policy, and last but not least, the perception of a substantial intrinsic fragility of the so-called Abrams Pact. Once again, the European Union has played a marginal role also in this negotiation process, missing an important opportunity to build its own solid and credible role. In conclusion, what I would like to underline, it's what I consider probably the most important element for the European Union, which is that of not missing opportunities coming from both Vienna and Baghdad in this moment. These dossiers could lead to overall redefinition of regional balances, opening up political and economic opportunities of enormous importance for us. Understanding the dynamics of this evolution and of this process and participating it with a constructive role is, in my opinion, what it should be the priority of the EU in this moment in order to prevent the drift of marginalization that unfortunately characterized probably the last 3 or 4 years of our action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. If I may start by actually taking us away from the 2 capitals that are in the title of this discussion, not Vienna, not Baghdad, but Tehran and Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. And Adnan, you flicked at the relevance of the politics of Iran with an election coming up on the discussions taking place in Vienna. I'm also curious to get from some of you your sense of what the changes that we are seeing in the government in Israel may possibly mean. Anel, if you don't mind, I'll start with you again. What are the concerns in Washington about, or indeed are there concerns about a possible change in the dynamic with Naftali Bennett running Israel in a coalition government, and with a hardliner, let's say Raisi, being president of Iran?
Definitely. And, it is certainly interesting seeing that recent move in Israel. And I haven't yet seen analysis of sort of Washington's been on a possible Naftali government. So I can't necessarily offer a lot of insights there, but I can speak about what we are observing, the likelihood that Ibrahim Raisi will be the president of Iran. And in general, I think there was a lot of frustration in Washington after Biden had essentially brought in the same people who negotiated the Jcpoa to serve in his administration, including people like Wendy Sherman and Rob Malley, Jake Sullivan. And then there seemed to be very little progress. And on the one hand, it is understandable given the level of crisis that the administration walked into, as well as the fact that obviously the Trump administration was unwilling to acknowledge Biden's win, and so were in no way willing to work with them to sort of foster a smooth transition. So it is understandable that Biden has been trying to put out a lot of fires. But on the other hand, a lot of people who assumed that the US would quickly return to the JCPOA, again, given that personnel is policy and that is who Biden brought in with him, there was some confusion there about why it was that it seemed that everything was moving so slowly, given widespread acknowledgement that the US policies of maximum pressure have justified the position of Iranian hardliners, that you cannot trust the United States, that returning to the JCPOA, that we can't count on the US to necessarily stand by its commitments, even if the US and Iran both do return, the concern that a future US administration might again just pull the US out again. And so I do think it is unfortunate. This is just sort of a continual pattern that we've seen in Washington-Tehran relations, where if you hardliners on one side, sometimes that's when you have more conciliatory partners on the other side. And it's been difficult to have them sort of match up with each other, where you have both sides being willing to engage with each other. And so that is what we're seeing now, that you have the Biden administration ostensibly being more willing to engage, but very soon being faced with what looks to be a very, very conservative and hardline Iranian government. As far as just a quick prediction on a Naftali government in Israel, it's hard to say. I mean, obviously, Bibi Netanyahu has been, I guess he's prime minister, sorry, has been clearly quite combative towards Iran. We saw him coming to Congress in 2015 and sort of an unprecedented move to speak to Congress directly and go around the Obama administration's efforts to negotiate a deal. But we also know that Naftali is hardly a sort of conciliatory or dovish figure. So it's unfortunately somewhat discouraging, I would say.
Right. Adnan, you told us, if I got you correctly, that a change of president in Tehran should not impact the discussions in Vienna, and you explained why. Are you at all concerned about the change in Israel of the government there and what impact that might have? Presumably the Biden administration will want the Bennett government to succeed, will want to see itself as being a friend to the Bennett government. And as Anel pointed out, Naftali Bennett is no less hawkish about Iran than Bibi Netanyahu was. Is there any reason you should be concerned or Iran should be concerned?
Well, I would obviously say that if you have a shift to more hawkish positions, either budging figures in Iran's government, or when the same figures start speaking in more hawkish terms. So just to compare, the tweets, the last series of tweets that Iran's foreign minister has been shooting out, compare those to those of like 4 years ago. So a general shift to a more hardline position, or to a clearer stance against the US, against the West, against Israel, etc. So when you have these shifts on different sides, then obviously that's the best thing that can happen to those who have always been promoting more radical statements. So having Naftali Bennett inheriting an uber hawkish Benjamin Netanyahu, having a more ideologue president in Tehran sitting there and being less pragmatic and in terms of realpolitik more willing to have a conciliatory tone. If these two come together, that's the perfect storm for potential crises and for hawkish messaging. But let's really not forget that we have already been seeing a major form of escalation in the Iran-Israel back and forth. We have seen almost weekly strikes by the Israelis in Syria. We have seen against Iranian-linked troops or Iranian troops. We have seen the operations of the Israeli intelligence services inside Iran, assassinating a nuclear scientist, things that have happened before. So there is a new level. And the reading in Tehran has been that Bibi Netanyahu's very hawkish line has more effectively trickled down also to the security establishment of the country. And at least that will continue to send worrying signals at all times. But what I really think is also important, while we keep that in mind and while we continue to be worried about anything that can happen between Israel and Iran, be it on Syrian territory, be it in the waters of the Red Sea, be it on Iranian territory, as we have seen, let's really also not forget that a reduced tension between Iran and DC through restoring the Jcpoa and reduced tensions between Iran and other states of the Persian Gulf, mainly UAE and Saudi Arabia, and these are the talks in Baghdad, should overall also help to ease tensions. And that's where our focus could be, that there's no question that there will at all times be enough reasons to worry, but I think we need some rest of worrying, and at some point really think about how can, also from a European perspective, how can there be a push, or from the US perspective, obviously, how can there be a push to support in very smart and sensible way the talks that are happening inside Iraq. And let's really not forget Iraq as a country that is in itself in crisis, super fragmented, has been able to be the host of these talks. So let's maybe also focus on that, while of course not neglecting other potential future crises. Back to you, Bobby.
Thank you. Fatma, you mentioned towards the end of your opening remarks that your concerns, and I've heard other people bring this up, about whether a new or a renewed JCPOA would stay in the long run. And the chances that a midterm election in the United States that brings the Republicans back into control of one or both of the houses, or 2.5, 3 years down the line, President Ivanka Trump decides to throw the JCPOA out the window. How much concern is there within the GCC, or from even just your personal point of view, how much concern is there that any negotiations that are taking place in Vienna now, at best, can be of temporary validity, because this is a decision being made by executive power in the United States without the backing of Congress. So this is just the executive. It's not the legislature of the United States. It's not a treaty. It's one man's signature, essentially. And as we have already seen, that one man's signature is not worth very much when the next man comes in or woman comes in and tosses it up.
It is actually a concern, because we've seen that once the deal was signed in 2015, the hopes were up. People started planning, what can we do with Iran? Including Oman, they started having more serious talks about having this gas pipeline between Oman and Iran.
Yes.
But again, once Trump took office and everybody saw that he is withdrawing from pulling the US out of the deal, that plan was stopped completely because of fear of US sanctions on Oman, which is again a similar fear that we've seen from France, because again we've seen a lot of French businessmen were very much interested in doing deals in Iran once the deal was announced. We have major oil companies like Shell, BP. They were also interested in doing business in Iran, but due to the fear of being sanctioned by the US, they had to put all these plans or everything on hold. And this fluctuation and lack of sustainability of having a clear vision of what might happen after 4 years is not healthy for anyone. Nobody can plan long term if this is the situation. And I think this is an ongoing concern. That's why I was saying that if there is a way that this deal does not stop only as an executive decision or by the president of the US, but somehow get passed as a law by the Congress, while the Democrats have both chambers.
But it's not quite as straightforward as that. I mean, for it to be a treaty, it needs 2/3 majority in the Senate,
Yes.
which plainly the president does not have. But it's interesting to me that nobody is demanding this. The Americans are not insisting on this. The Biden administration is not, perhaps in recognition of the fact that they may not have the political capital to pull it off. But the Iranians aren't asking for it.
They have nothing to gain out of it. Whether there is a deal with Iran or there is no deal with Iran, they have nothing to gain out of it, and at the same time they don't lose, because the US itself, or whoever is making the decision in the US, they are not having a first-hand experience of what's happening in this part of the world where there is no peace. They do not see the vessels getting attacked in the Strait of Hormuz or outside the Strait of Hormuz. They cannot feel the rockets flying over the skies of Saudi Arabia. So they actually don't see that. They don't feel it. That's why there is no urgency.
But at the same time, Fatma, you don't hear GCC governments insisting on it. You don't hear Iran, despite having been burned once. Iran is not insisting that on any sort of additional guarantees. You don't hear the Europeans asking for it.
It is surprising, which raises the question: Is everybody really interested in this deal? Is it that important? If the parties are not insisting on its sustainability beyond 4 years or few years, to what extent is this deal actually important?
Let me ask Nicola. Nicola, from your perspective, why do you think the Europeans are not I can see why they are keen to get back into the JCPOA, but why do you think they're making no attempt to prevent a repeat of what we saw over the last 3 years? Sorry, Nicola, you're muted.
Sure, sorry. Well, I don't know exactly what's the reason behind this incapacity. What I can say is that it seems quite controversial, the role of the EU3 in this phase. So the incapacity of crafting and delivering a strategy which could be, let's say, representing the interest of the European Union as expressed by the external action, by Borrell, by the institution. And at the same time, there is clearly the need felt at the European Union level to be ready to build something which could allow Euro to be credible when it will be ready, when the JCPOA will be sold as a negotiation in Vienna, to be ready and to be credible in terms of financial institutions. So working in where we have mostly failed in the previous 4 years of the 6 years, sorry, of the JCPOA life. So that's where the Europeans are, in my opinion, lacking more and more in the capacity of providing a solution. Even the technical aspect connected to Instinct, as I said before, proved to be not enough strong, not enough politically strong. And this is where we have to provide an answer. This is where we should try to define a strategy also, because I don't think that the JCPOA, which will be almost certainly come out of this negotiation, will be that much different from the one we had before. So should not be that much complicated or difficult to identify now a strategy, a solution, a way from one side to engage the Americans, and on the other side to provide a local European domestic capacity of sustaining the new JCPOA with something credible. We are not exactly working in this direction. We are going one by one, as always, and that's, in my opinion, the most critical aspect of this phase. The risk of again falling in the same kind of problems we had in the past is behind the corner, and I can see in this phase any practical attempt to provide something new, something more solid, something more credible, and something able to reinforce our capacity in the event of a success, which I think is at end in this moment.
Yeah. Adnan, let me ask you this. Why do you think the Iranians don't seem to be making any attempt to reach across the other side of the aisle in the United States? This was quite noticeable in the lead up to 2015. There was very little attempt to try and communicate with the Republicans. There was a feeling that if Obama signed it, that would be enough. And if the other signatories signed it and they took it to the United Nations, that would be enough. So they've learned, they should have learned that doesn't work. Why has there not been any kind of attempt, as far as we can tell, from the Iranians to try and make sure history does not repeat itself? You have to unmute. Sorry.
It's May 2021, almost June, and we're still on mute while we start talking. Sorry. There have been different, Iran has been insisting on different conditions that need to be met before any return to the JCPOA or any talk can happen. They at times obviously were then scaled down, things like the compensation that was on the table at the beginning, so that basically the US has to compensate particularly for the years 2018 until 2021 or 2020 for all the economic damage. At the same time, the US had also its demands. So I think the maximalist positions at the beginning on each side have gradually come down to a level in which things become more reasonable. And I think the one change that we're seeing right now is the following: that when the nuclear agreement was signed in, or was finalized as the terminology goes, in July 2015, Iran was willing to do the first step, do all technical things that needs to be done in the then following 6 months, for those to be verified by the IAEA, so that finalization day can lead to implementation day in January 2016. But Iran effectively took the first step. This time around, Iran is saying this should be reversed. We can, in some ways, and that's what my reading is of the messaging from Tehran, give some concessions or some guarantees that we won't escalate further with our nuclear program and get further away from the original JCPOA now. For you, the dear US, to promise that all JCPOA related sanctions will be lifted, then we are the ones who will verify. That's what the Iranian officials say, not me, the Iranian officials. And then once they have verified that, Iran will then again go back to the technical obligations it has, so that effectively both sides are back in compliance. That is one lesson learned, if you will, so that once Iran can effectively say we are seeing that sanctions are lifted, yes, we are seeing immediate impacts of sanctions being lifted, for example, by oil not only being sold, but also shipped, that shipment being having been covered by insurance, the money going through a legal bank transaction into Iran's bank. This is the type of verification Iran needs to do. So that's, I think, at as much as Iran can get. Turning this into a treaty is on the one hand understandable, but we have seen what a certain Donald Trump has done with treaties as well. So it's all about implementation, and the motivations and incentives to implement the deal when it is restored will have to be stronger than some legal technical solutions all sides come up with. I hope that makes sense. Back to you, Bobby.
Anel, a few weeks before 2015, before the deal was signed, a group of, I think, 43 Republican senators wrote an open letter to Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, warning him that any deal that he signed would not be worth the paper it was signed on, any deal that Obama signed. And you can't say the Iranians weren't warned, and the Republicans were true to their word, destructive as we might think it was. They gave warning and they followed through on their warning. We're hearing similar rumblings now, and this time it's not just the Republicans. You have a few Democrats who are also concerned about Biden returning to the old JCPOA. They want to see a version 2.0 with some additions, longer and stronger, and all kinds of other phrases like that. Should we be worried that if the Republicans take the House or the Senate in a couple of years' time, or if there's a Republican president further down the road, that we may see this movie again?
Thanks. I mean, on the one hand, obviously we should be worried, but in general, I do think that it's quite instructive that the past several successful presidential campaigns have all adopted the rhetoric of ending the endless wars, of getting the US out of the Middle East, from Obama to Trump to Biden. And so, and in general, we know that public opinion polling throughout the United States demonstrates that Americans are quite sick of fighting these wars abroad. And so, in general, I do think that if the U.S. Were to—
That's a war, though. I mean, the situation with Iran over the last 4 years has stopped short of actual war. Would Americans tolerate a continuation of that? As Fatma said, they are not the ones suffering.
No, I think Fatma's point was crucial here. But in general, I think, if we did see a situation where tensions continue to remain high in the region, the US, as we almost saw happened after the US assassinated Qasem Soleimani at the beginning of 2020, that the US and Iran almost went to war over that. And it was only Iranian restraint that prevented those already high tensions from escalating further. And so again, as the United States is really trying to shift to finally carry out this so-called pivot to Asia, and also to focus on other much more important security concerns like global pandemics, like climate change, that there really is a lot of weariness among the American public with the ongoing attention and resources that the United States continues to spend on the Middle East. So I think in general, when congressional Republicans continue to be so completely unwilling to engage in any sort of negotiations with Iran, that this does not reflect American public opinion, that Americans are really quite sick of the Middle East and all of the attention it continues to take. And so these congressional Republicans need to reflect the desires of their own constituencies.
That'll be the day. But Fatma, what do you, just quickly, what do you make of when you're sitting in the GCC, what do you think when you hear American presidents, this one being the latest, saying, I want to pivot away from the Middle East and pay more attention to China?
Funny, but I think the less the U.S. and the military troops are involved and are based on in this part of the world, the escalations will be, we will not see more escalations from other parties, because military presence begets military presence from the other party as well. They attract each other. So I think the less troops we have in the region, the less intervention, it will make everyone in the region wants to talk to the other, whether it's directly or via a messenger, like what's happening in Baghdad now. And I think this is a good translation on, as Anil said from the beginning, when Saudi felt that, yeah, it's up to us now after the attacks on Aramco, and we have to deal with this presence of Iran and its support to Houthis. We have to do it ourselves. We cannot rely on the US to come and rescue us. I think this is a wake-up call to everyone in this part of the world, that we cannot rely on the US to come and stop a danger from happening, because the people, the public in the US, they will not take it for long. They don't want to lose soldiers. They don't want to lose thousands of people, like what happened in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and other wars in this part of the world, which is very understandable. And here in the world, in the GCC or Middle East, again, they don't want to see troops intervening. Yes, they would welcome friendly talks. They would welcome people to help in negotiation, in mediation, or to offer some solutions, but not with force, because this will not help. The solution cannot come from outside. It will have to be from within the region.
Okay. I see that there are no questions yet from the audience. It may be that we're having some technical difficulties. So I will take advantage of that by, as I promised, putting all of you on the spot and asking you to challenge one, or preferably one, but possibly other than one of the other panelists with a question of your own. Nicola, why don't you go first?
Thank you. To pose a question to Adnan, and it's something I am quite curious in this moment, because first of all, I think that, well, it's quite clear that the elections next June 18 are going to follow an already written path. So it's going to be almost probably right-wing. And I don't understand why Iranians overprotected an already strong candidate from one side. So why risking in terms of credibility and legitimacy on one side, but on the other side, my personal idea is that Raisi will not be serving as a radical president. He has no interest in doing this. He's not coming probably even from the more radical environment, despite what the narrative it's suggesting. And so I was willing to ask Adnan what he thinks about these two things. Okay. So why the decision, and what it would be, Raisi's presidency.
Go ahead, Adnan. If you don't mind, keep your answer brief, because I want to make sure everyone gets a chance.
Yes, I will follow with the challenge to Fatma, if I may, dear Bobby.
Of course.
Yes, Fatma, wait for it. No, the point, dear Nicola, is that to me, it's clear that there is this idea that there needs to be a clear shift in how the executive branch of the future should be conducting its policies, and the shift is, if we were to follow the words of the Supreme Leader, who we assume to be the grand designer of all of this, ultimately, obviously, would be that he said the current situation is not going to be about foreign policy or cyberspace, but about the economic livelihoods of the people and basically domestic issues, which means one of the biggest issues that drives people mad the most in Iran is the topic of corruption. Now, obviously, anti-corruption campaigns in Iran and in this part of the world is always selective. But I think in terms of giving it a clear face, that might be the one of Ebrahim Raisi. But again, I have been wrong on many accounts in the past months with regards to the elections. So to me, it's even not yet clear that Raisi will end up being the president. But if he were to be president, I think the most important two things for the discussions we're having today is that I suppose that there will be continuity both in Vienna and in Baghdad. And that's what we are discussing today. All the other things need to be discussed. And since I mentioned Baghdad, and with your permission, Bobby, Fatma, my question to you would be, why are these talks hosted by Iraq and not by Oman? And I want to put you on the spot there. You're sitting in Muscat. So why are you not hosting these talks? Isn't that what Muscat has been all about? Fatma, please.
Yes, Muscat has been a home for the negotiations, or some of the negotiations for the first deal. But I think that also put Oman on the hot seat. It got a lot of heat, a lot of criticism from different parties or different countries. It's been accused that it's taking Iran's side against the GCC or its neighbors, which it was not fair for Oman, and Oman suffered from that on a diplomatic level. So I think Oman now is choosing to be supportive of other people's efforts. That's what we've seen in the Gulf crisis, where Oman was supporting the initiative taken by late Amir Sabah of Kuwait to bring the countries together. And now, again, with the negotiations in Baghdad, they are willing to support, but they will not initiate a mediation effort whenever they are asked to be part, or to at least recommend someone to get in touch with, they will not lose that chance to be of a citizen, but they will not take the lead because they don't want to be on that spot again. That's what I think.
Your turn, since you have the mic, Fatma.
Okay, my question is going to be to Nicola about what can Europe do? Let's say this deal falls apart, it does not work. Um, to what extent the Parliament in Europe is willing to take an action or to take a step to have any sort of normalized relation with Iran, or to the European Parliament, it's not a big deal. Is it a big deal or not?
Well, I think it's a big deal, a really big deal. And the problem is how to manage it. And that's where we are in this moment. So everybody knows that this is one probably of the biggest deal the Parliament will have to handle. But on the other side, I think there is no plan B if something goes wrong. And that's what I fear. It could interest the European Union as a whole in after Vienna. But again, let me say that I'm quite optimistic over the evolution of the negotiation. So probably it's just a scaramantic fear, but it's that's where we are.
Anel, your question, please.
My question actually perhaps builds somewhat on Fatma's and goes back to Nicola, and especially I think goes to Nicola's opening comments about his concerns about the marginalization of the EU, not just in terms of the JCPOA, but sort of in general, and the need for the EU to try to stand up more to the United States. And I'm just curious to hear whether from Nicola or if Ernest would like to jump in on this as well, their thoughts on what it will take for the EU to avoid marginalization in other issues as well.
Go ahead.
So, well, I think that we have demonstrated in the last 6-7 years the incapacity of the Europeans of drafting strategies and carrying out proper plans over the region because of the traditional incapacity of the Europeans of agreeing on the most elementary elements of our common interest. And Iran is not even the worst, in my opinion, of the cases that we have seen in the last decade. From an Italian point of view, if I have to, for example, to discuss about Libya, I think it's much worse than what we have seen over the debate regarding the JCPOA and Iran, or even on the issue of regarding Syria or Yemen. So that's why I think that in this phase, at least for the JCPOA, for the discussion in Vienna, we have to regroup in supporting the US. And since there is a common interest both on the US and Iranian side, there is a visible, tangible interest in achieving a result, try to transform this into also an European agenda, an European, let's say, goal. And it's probably the only thing that we can do in this moment.
We have one question from the audience, and then I'll come to you, Ernest. It's from Eldar Mamedov of the European Parliament. I think I'm going to address it to Adnan because you seem to be the right person for it. So the question is, would it be reasonable to expect that a more conservative government in Tehran will be in a better position to secure a regional deal with Saudi Arabia than any reformist one? The argument being that there would be less daylight between the government's position and the deeper security establishment's position. So it's a bit like Nixon to China. Would President Raisi, let's just say for theory's sake, be in a better position to make a deal with MBS than Rouhani would?
As unsatisfactory as it might be, I think it has to be seen whether Iran is in a better position in terms of its foreign policy, courageous foreign policy decisions, when those who lead the negotiations are basically part and very well connected to what some refer to as the deep state. If that unison or that unity is there, that's on the one hand a good thing, because there won't be no sabotaging acts or something like that against it. The question, however, is the tools, the diplomatic tools, the different techniques of negotiating things. Is this something that such a team can also accomplish? So we will have to find out. We will have to find out whether a team composed of President Raisi, let's put him as the potential frontrunner here, a team composed of him, and not having any figure like Abbas Araghchi around or Javad Zarif or others, will he be also able to find this, to accomplish the same sort of deals? Then yes, we could actually think that there might be less pushback domestically, and therefore it's more solid. But again, you are dealing now with a country that tries to handle three things at the same time: regional dialogue, a strategic partnership with the US, and the Jcpoa, which is supposed to normalize trade with Europe. Now, champion managing all of this. And but again, this is something that we will yet have to find out. Maybe there's a composition of both, those who are diplomatically skilled and those who are deeply entrenched in the so-called deep state. Back to you, Bobby.
All right, we have a question from our host, Ernest.
Thank you, Bobby. Well, Fatma said before in her presentation, the Jcpoa will not be expanded. I would maybe like you to elaborate a bit more on that, because there have been a lot of people in Brussels thinking about that the resuming Jcpoa may lead us also to try to build something broader as a security strategy in the region. Why do you think this will not happen?
I don't think I said it will not be expanded, but the hopes for it to work and to be sustained, it's very difficult, because even what the deal started with in 2015, that was very difficult to sustain. Yeah, because not everybody was happy about it, but at least it was something. At least it was agreed on by the main players. But that did not sustain. That did not stand at the wind of the changes in the U.S. administration. So this will continue as long as there is no power, no other power but the U.S. is willing to take a stand and to continue the path and the road with Iran to get it involved in the international community. I think this will always be a challenge. And until we have that other power, that alternative power or player to take the hand of Iran and reintegrate it into the world, this will the deal will always be lacking something, and someone will always won't be happy about it.
Adnan, anything to add on that?
Not particularly on that. I just think that we have something at hand that serves as a starting point. So why not using it? And it's clear that there needs to be.
Why do you call it a starting point when the Iranian government constantly says that this is the only thing they're willing to discuss? No talk of any.
This is the only thing they want to discuss in this formula, but things like regional dialogue is happening, which is just not happening under the Jcpoa formula. Let's call it the EU E3+3 or the P5+1. This is where Iran doesn't want to talk anything else, but we are seeing continuous talks held in Baghdad. And this goes back to the link of Baghdad and Vienna, that can basically add up to the Jcpoa, something that has been missing before. So that's why I would say that can in fact help.
And I'll since we started with you, I'll finish with you. We're drawing in. What happened to the Biden administration's initial inclination to ask for a broader deal? Have they basically gone back on that and decided that's not possible and therefore not worth trying? Or is there some indication that they still would like to get at least one other concession, at least a if you like, something to put on the showcase, some sort of window dressing to suggest that the Jcpoa there is a Jcpoa plus?
I mean, as you said, Secretary of State Blinken does continue to use the longer and stronger word, which are somewhat unfortunate words, choice of words. So I think the Biden administration continues to say that it is interested in expanding on the deal, and yet I don't anticipate that this will happen. And in part, I think it's the reality that the Iranians have stated quite clearly that they expect the United States to rejoin the deal, that it was the US that pulled out, and it's the US that has undermined trust here and needs to be the first to try to reestablish some kind of trust. And I think if the US does return successfully to the JCPOA, there won't be as much of an incentive because Iran's nuclear program will have been contained. And at that point, I do think Biden is really interested in focusing on other areas. And I do think this is appropriate. As I said in my opening remarks, regional actors need to take charge of regional issues, that they need to be at the table, they need to be negotiating this, and that in the future, as we're seeing a smaller role for the United States in the Middle East, as these actors are anticipating, it wouldn't really be appropriate for the US to try to negotiate these outcomes or to make these decisions when it's really about the concerns of local actors on the ground.
Well, I'm going to sum up briefly before handing the mic back to Ernest. There have been a couple of late questions that came in. Unfortunately, they did come in a little late, and so I'm going to park those for the moment. I hope there'll be opportunities for more such discussions that you can join and get a chance to ask. And you can, of course, reach out to us through Ernest as well. I think it's fair to say that there is in the panel optimism that the JCPOA will be resuscitated. We're a little unclear about the timeline there. There seems to be an expectation that even if there is a change of government in Iran, even if the hardliner takes over from President Rouhani, that the deal will still go through because the broader political ecosystem in Iran is in favor of the JCPOA. Where I picked up signs of uncertainty were about how to make sure that that we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years are not repeated again. That should there be another change in the White House, or even a Republican return to a majority in the Senate, any of the promises that are made in Vienna might not once again be tossed out of the window. But there is hope that there may be some way to prevent that history from repeating itself. We will see how things go. I think we're getting to the point now, for any number of reasons, we're getting to a point where decision day is coming soon, not just in Vienna, but also in Tehran with the election. And there is a finite amount of political capital that the President of the United States has to invest. He has some very, very large other challenges to deal with, including this giant budget that he's trying to push through, dealings with Russia, dealings with dealing with China. So I think we're getting to a point where if there is not something concrete very soon, let's say in another month and a half, then there might be the chance that this thing the can gets kicked down the road, and the current sort of uncertainty remains for a while. From my part, I want to thank all the panelists for joining us and for sharing with us the benefit of their wisdom and their thinking on this very important topic. And I will now hand back to Ernest, our host, with my personal thanks for inviting me to moderate this and for making this possible. Ernest, back to you.
Thank you so much, Bobby, and thanks to all of you for this fantastic panel. I think we all learned a lot from all of you, so thank you for that. I think that there is a small momentum of optimism, I would say. I would define it that way, and a window of opportunity. This is how I see it, at least in the short term. So this is what I sense also from the discussion. I also fear, as Bobby said, that there is certain optimism that the Vienna talks will resume and they will end well. And this, of course, will will be an extremely good news for the region, but also for Europe and for the US. Now the question, and I think this is where we more reflected upon, is will that be enough to secure the regional stability? And here the question, that the answers from you are more nuanced, in the sense that many of you believe that we need really regional dialogue to step in order for that to be successful. We have seen skepticism whether Jcpoa can be expanded. All that could, whether that could be the seed for something broader. But in any case, and bouncing back on what Nicola said, I think that what Europe needs to think, it's how to strengthen its own position. That's clear. And the reason why Europe is not credible enough is because in the last years, it hasn't been able to secure the continuation of the Jcpoa, which is what the Iranians were expecting the Europeans to do. And despite we tried by putting instruments like Instex in place, we did not manage to counter the US sanctions. Europe failed on that. And I think one of the conclusions also of the panel is, if we want the Jcpoa to be credible, the Europeans need to be more credible also, that they will be able to make the Jcpoa be secure in the medium and the long term. So I think this is also something that Brussels needs to reflect better upon. So voila, some thoughts as a conclusion, but I would like to thank you again. Thank you to the audience who attended. And I'm going to remind everybody that this has been recorded. I'm going to post it in my social media. So if you want to spread it, send it to friends whom you think it would be interesting for them. It will be just ready in a couple of hours online. So thank you so much again. And thank you particularly to Bobby for moderating the session. Thank you. And
thank you very much.